Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I spent 15 years studying the ocean. I've measured currents in the Arctic and thermal vents in the Pacific. I've tracked whale migrations and mapped underwater canyons that no human eye has ever seen. The ocean is my life, my career, my obsession. I thought I understood it as well as anyone could understand something so vast and ancient and deep. I was wrong. I didn't understand anything. My name is Declan Shea. I'm 40 years old, Irish-American, working as a senior oceanographer for the Pacific Maritime Research Institute out of San Diego. 6 months ago, my institute received some unusual data from a Chilean naval survey conducted near Easter Island. Temperature fluctuations that didn't match any known pattern. Currents that seemed to move against prevailing winds. Sonar returns from depths that should have been empty. They sent me to investigate. Routine assignment, they said. Probably instrument errors or localized volcanic activity. Nothing that couldn't be explained with a week of fieldwork and proper calibration. I wish they'd sent someone else. I wish I'd never gone. Easter Island is one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth. Over 2,000 miles from the nearest populated landmass, a tiny speck of volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The Polynesians who settled there centuries ago called it Rapa Nui. The rest of the world knows it for the statues. The moai, those massive stone figures that stare with blank eyes across the empty landscape. I arrived during the off-season when the tourist crowds thin out and the island feels like what it really is, a remote, windswept rock at the edge of the world. I rented a small boat, set up my equipment, and started taking measurements in the waters surrounding the island. The readings were strange from the first day. Water temperature would drop sharply at random intervals, sometimes by 10 degrees or more, then return to normal within minutes. Currents shifted direction without any meteorological cause, flowing against the wind, against the tides, against everything I understood about how water moves. My sonar picked up a mass deep below the surface, but the shape kept changing. Sometimes it looked like a dense school of fish. Sometimes it looked like a single enormous object. Sometimes it looked like nothing at all. I told myself there were explanations. Underwater volcanic activity could cause temperature fluctuations. Strange currents could result from unusual seafloor topography. The sonar returns could be equipment glitches, or maybe a whale pod moving through the area. But on the third day, I noticed something that didn't fit any explanation I could think of. The anomalies were worse when I was watching. When I sat at my instruments, monitoring the screens, recording every fluctuation, the readings went haywire. Temperature spikes, current reversals, sonar echoes suggesting massive movement in the deep water. But when I left the instruments running unattended and checked the data later, everything was calm. Normal temperatures, predictable currents, empty water. I ran the comparison 3 times, same results every time. The anomalies only happened when someone was observing them. I didn't know what to make of that. I still don't, not really. But it was the first sign that something was very wrong with the water around Easter Island. On my fourth day, I took a break from the research to see the famous statues. It seemed wrong to visit Easter Island without at least looking at them, and I needed time away from my instruments to clear my head. I hired a local guide named Rosa, a woman in her 30s with dark hair and a patient smile. She ran tours during the high season when the cruise ships came, but during the off-season, she was happy for the work. She drove me around the island in an old truck, stopping at the major sites where the moai stood in rows on their stone platforms. They were impressive, I'll admit. Some of them were over 30 feet tall, carved from volcanic rock and transported across the island by methods that archaeologists still argue about. They had massive heads, long faces, heavy brows, and they all faced the same direction, inland. Every single statue on the island faced away from the ocean, staring at the empty interior with those blank, weathered eyes. I'd read about this before I came, but seeing it in person made it stranger somehow. Hundreds of enormous figures, all with their backs to the sea. I asked Rosa why. She gave me the standard explanation. The moai represent ancestors, she said. They face the villages to watch over their descendants. They're protectors, guardians. Their eyes look inward to keep the people safe. I thought about that for a moment, then pointed out something that had been bothering me. If they were protectors, wouldn't they face outward? Wouldn't they watch for threats coming from the sea? Every other coastal culture I knew of built their defenses facing the water. Castles on cliff tops, watchtowers on beaches, walls along harbors. Why would the Rapa Nui turn their guardians around to face away from the most likely direction of danger? Rosa was quiet for a moment. She said that some researchers had asked that question. The usual answer was that the Rapa Nui believed threats came from within, from warfare between clans, competition for resources. The statues faced inward to keep peace between the villages, but something in her expression told me she didn't entirely believe that explanation. That night, I found Rosa at a small bar in Hangaroa, the island's only town. I bought her a drink and asked her about the statues again. She was reluctant at first, but after a while, she started talking. She said there were other stories, older stories, stories the elders didn't share with tourists or researchers or anyone from the outside world. Some of the old people believed the statues weren't always facing inland. They believed the moai were originally built facing the ocean, like watchers, like sentinels keeping guard over the sea. But something happened. Something came from the water, and the people turned the statues around. Not to protect the island, she said, to stop looking at what was out there. I asked her what she meant. She just shook her head and said, I should talk to her grandmother's brother, an old man named Kiri, who still remembered the stories from before the missionaries came. Kiri was one of the last fluent speakers of the old Rapa Nui language. He was in his 80s, thin and weathered, with eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. He didn't want to talk to an outsider at first, but Rosa vouched for me, and eventually he agreed to share what he knew. We sat in his small house near the edge of town, and he told me about the thing in the water. The ancestors understood something that modern people have forgotten, he said. There is something in the deep ocean around the island. It has been there since before humans arrived. Maybe since before the island itself rose from the sea. The old name for it doesn't translate well into English. But the closest meaning is something like the thing that grows when watched. I asked him what that meant. He said it feeds on attention, on observation, on acknowledgement. The more eyes that look at it, the stronger it becomes. The more people who know about it, think about it, watch the water for signs of it, the more powerful and real it gets. The ancestors learned this the hard way. In the early generations, when the moai still faced the ocean, the thing grew bold. It came closer to the shore. Fishing boats disappeared. People vanished from the beaches at night. The elders realized what was happening. Their constant watching, their vigilant attention to the sea, was feeding it, making it stronger. So they turned the statues around. All of them. Every single moai rotated on their platforms to face inland. The people were forbidden to look at the ocean after dark, forbidden to speak of what was out there, forbidden to acknowledge its existence in any way. It took generations, Kiri said, but it worked. Starved of attention, the thing weakened. It retreated to the deep water. It slept. I asked him why he was telling me this. Why share it with an outsider after keeping it secret for so long? He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. He said the old solution worked when the island was isolated, when the only eyes belonged to a small population who knew better than to look. But now things are different. Tourists come by the thousands. Research vessels circle the island with their instruments and cameras. Cruise ships pass by, carrying passengers who line the rails to stare at the water. Satellites photograph the ocean from space. The thing that spent centuries being starved is being fed again, and it's waking up. I thanked Kiri for his time. I went back to my rented room and lay awake most of the night, telling myself it was just a legend, a folk tale, the kind of story isolated cultures invent to explain the dangers of the sea. But I couldn't stop thinking about my readings, the anomalies that only happened when I was watching, the pattern I'd noticed and couldn't explain. The next morning, I designed an experiment. I set up 2 identical sets of instruments at the same location, about a mile offshore on the western side of the island. One set I monitored continuously, sitting in my boat and watching the screens, recording every fluctuation. The other set I left completely unattended, sealed in a waterproof case, programmed to collect data automatically with no human observation. I ran the experiment for 24 hours. Then I compared the results. The attended instruments recorded dozens of anomalies, temperature drops of 15 degrees or more, current reversals that defied physics, sonar returns that suggested something massive moving in the deep water, rising and falling, circling beneath my boat like a shark around prey. The unattended instruments recorded almost nothing. Calm water, normal temperatures, empty sonar, same location, the same time period, completely different results. I ran the experiment again, same outcome, and again, same outcome. The anomalies only happened when someone was watching. I sat in my boat as the sun went down, trying to make sense of what I'd found. I'm a scientist. I believe in data, in evidence, in explanations that can be tested and verified. I don't believe in monsters or curses or things that feed on attention. But the data was clear. Something in the water responded to observation, something that grew more active, more present, more real when eyes were on it. That night, I did something stupid. I went to the water's edge. I told myself I needed to see. I needed to know. I walked down to a rocky stretch of coastline on the western shore, far from town, far from the tourist sites. The sun had just set, and the sky was that deep purple color it gets in the tropics, fading to black at the horizon. I stood on the rocks and looked at the ocean. For a long time, there was nothing, just water and sky and the distant sound of waves. I started to feel foolish. What was I expecting? A sea monster to rise up and wave at me? Then I saw it. Not clearly, not completely. A darkness beneath the surface about 100 yards offshore, darker than the water around it, darker than the anything should be in the fading twilight. It was big. I couldn't tell how big, but the shadow of it seemed to stretch further than my eyes could follow. And it was moving, rising slowly toward the surface, turning toward me, responding to my gaze like a plant turning toward the sun. I looked away. I forced my eyes down to the rocks beneath my feet, to my hands, to anything but the water. My heart was slamming against my ribs. My whole body was shaking. I understood in that moment why the statues faced inland. Not because they were watching over the villages, because they couldn't bear to look at what was behind them. I stumbled back from the water's edge. I didn't look at the ocean again. I walked back to town with my eyes on the ground, and I didn't sleep at all that night. The next few days, I thought about what Kiri had told me, about how the old solution had worked when the island was isolated, when the only eyes belonged to people trained from birth to never look, never acknowledge, never feed the thing with their attention. I thought about tourism, about the cruise ships that circled the island every week during high season, carrying thousands of passengers who lined the rails with cameras and binoculars, staring at the coastline, staring at the water. About research vessels like my own, with sonar and underwater cameras and instruments designed specifically to observe what was in the ocean. About satellites passing overhead, photographing every square mile of sea, feeding images to databases that anyone with internet access could browse. For centuries, the thing in the water had been starved. The only humans who knew about it were a tiny population on a remote island, trained to avert their eyes. Now it had millions of observers, billions maybe. Every tourist who gazed at the Pacific, every researcher who studied the water, every person who looked at a photograph of the island and wondered what was in the ocean around it. The old solution couldn't work anymore. There was no way to turn humanity's attention away from the sea. I reviewed my data from the week. The anomalies were getting stronger, more frequent. The thing down there was growing, fed by my observation, by my research, by the very act of trying to understand it. And I realized something horrible. I was making it worse just by knowing about it. Now that I knew, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time my mind wandered to what was in the water, I was feeding it. Every time I wondered how deep it went, or what it looked like, or how close it was to the surface, I was giving it exactly what it wanted. I thought about my report, about the data I'd send back to my institute, about the other researchers who would read it, wonder about it, investigate it, each one of them adding their attention to the thing's diet, each one of them making it stronger. The trap was perfect. The more you learned about it, the more you fed it, the more you feared it, the more you thought about it, and the more you tried to warn others the more people would know and the more eyes would turn toward the water. I left the island a week later. I didn't file a full report. I told my institute the readings were instrument errors, probably caused by localized volcanic activity. Nothing significant, not worth further study. I destroyed my data, wiped my hard drives, threw my handwritten notes into the ocean. I tried to forget what I'd seen, what I'd learned, but I can't forget. That's the trap. Once you know about the thing in the water, you can't unknow it. Every time you think about it, you feed it. Every time you remember what you saw, you make it stronger. Before I left the island, I visited the moai one last time. I stood in front of a row of them, their massive stone backs turned to the sea, their blank eyes staring at nothing. I used to think they were facing the wrong direction. I used to think it was strange that they didn't watch the ocean. Now I understand. They're not guardians. They're not protectors. They're a lesson carved in stone, 500 years old, standing in silent rows to show us what we should do. Don't look, don't watch, don't acknowledge. The only defense against the thing in the water is to pretend it doesn't exist. But it's too late for that. We've been feeding it for decades with our cameras and our satellites and our endless, hungry curiosity. It's been growing stronger while we studied the ocean and mapped the seafloor and sent submarines into the deep places where humans were never meant to go. I'm back in San Diego now. I have a new assignment, studying currents in the North Pacific, far from Easter Island. I try to focus on my work. I try not to think about what I saw. But I catch myself looking at the ocean sometimes, standing on the beach at sunset, scanning the water for shadows that are darker than they should be, wondering if it's spread beyond the island, if it's followed the attention that feeds it, if it's growing somewhere beneath the waves of the California coast right now. Every time I catch myself looking, I turn away. I force my eyes to the sand, to the sky, to anything but the water. But the damage is already done. I've already thought about it. I've already fed it with another moment of attention. And now you're thinking about it too. That's the thing I can't escape. The thing that keeps me awake at night. By telling you this, I've made you part of the problem. Now you know. Now you'll think about it. Now, every time you look at the ocean, some part of your mind will wonder if something is looking back. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry I couldn't keep it to myself. But I had to tell someone. I had to warn people, even though the warning itself makes things worse. The statues on Easter Island are facing the wrong direction. That's what everyone thinks. They should face the ocean. They should watch for danger. They should guard against whatever might come from the sea. But they're not facing the wrong direction. They're facing the only direction that might have saved us, inland, away from the water, refusing to look at what's out there. It's too late to turn around now, too late to stop watching. The cameras are everywhere. The satellites never sleep. Humanity's gaze is fixed on the ocean, and the thing beneath the surface is drinking it in. I don't know how much bigger it needs to get. I don't know how strong it needs to become. But some night soon, I think, it won't need us to look at it anymore. It'll make us see.